Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas. And his Catholic faith is day 202. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 168 and 169 of the secundae, that is, of modesty as consisting in the outward movements of the body and of modesty in the outward apparel. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10, and so here we go. Article 1, whether any virtue regards the outward movements of the body. And since the outward movements can be directed by reason, they can also fall short or live up to the rule of reason, and thus they are subject to virtue and vice. As bodily movements and actions display a kind of taste, this kind of temperance, curbing desire so as to act in a way representing oneself becomingly in respect to oneself and the time in which they live, this kind of moderation pertains to the virtue of honestum, the virtuous beauty we discussed in day 190. Then insofar as modesty in actions is directed towards others or affects my neighbor, this modesty belongs to the virtue of affability, that annexed part of justice whereby one acts in a becoming way towards others. So outward movements, whether looked at from the perspective of personal integrity coming to the fore in an external beauty, or as a kind of justice towards others, then we can respond in the affirmative to our article's question that there is virtue in the outward movements of the body. Article 2, whether there can be a virtue about games. And betraying my Carthusian background here, Aquinas will respond in this article using an analogy of a bow, which reminds me of the same analogy as detailed by St. Bruno in his letter to Raoul Leverd. Bruno wrote, "Scenes like these, speaking of the wilderness surrounding the monastery, are often a relaxation and a diversion for fragile spirits wearied by strict rule and attention to spiritual things. If the bow is stretched for too long, it becomes slack and unfit for its purpose." Which is the same argument Aquinas makes here, that just as the body requires physical rest to later persevere in working, the mind also needs rest, and that resting in the good, technically speaking, is what joy is. So this virtue, eutrapelia in the Greek, is a virtue, the virtue of mental rest via some pleasantry. Jucundus is the Latin Aquinas uses here, which we can translate pleasantness or delight. So there is a virtue concerning games insofar as it is a virtuous way to rest the mind for the sake of later activity, since the mind is wearied, especially in contemplating the abstract or the immaterial, because it is beyond that aspect of us which is animal. The rest of the mind, resting in some mental good, is what joy is, and games can bring joy in the manner of a playful dialogue with a friend, or even the beauty of the countryside, as St. Bruno understood. Of course, this is by no means an excuse to throw off restraint and an excuse for frivolous indulgence, but if one acts according to reason, keeping their ultimate end in mind, which is God, and the provided means to that end, which is imitation of Christ, a resting of the mind in some pleasantness can be advantageous and thereby virtuous. In St. Thomas's words, there can be a virtue about games. Aristotle gives it the name of wittiness, and a man is said to be pleasant through having a happy turn of mind, whereby he gives his words and deeds a cheerful turn. And inasmuch as this virtue restrains a man from immoderate fun, it is comprised under modesty. Article 3, whether there can be sin in the excess of play. We read in this article, excess play pertains to senseless mirth, which Gregory the Great calls a daughter of gluttony. So there can be sin in excess of play precisely because it is an excess. Yet such excess will not be mortally sinful unless it be to the degree that it infringe on charity or the rights of God and neighbor, As St. Thomas teaches here, it may be mortal sin on account of the strong attachment to play, when a man prefers the pleasure he derives therefrom to the love of God, so as to be willing to disobey a commandment of God or of the church rather than forego such like amusements. Sometimes, however, it is a venial sin, for instance, where a man is not so attached to amusement as to be willing for its sake to do anything in disobedience to God. Article 4, whether there is a sin in lack of mirth. The Latin here for mirth is ludus or game, so is a lack of playfulness sinful? And insofar as it is contrary to affability or the general friendliness which we ought to render to the people around us for the sake of neighbor and the common good, then a lack of playfulness could be sinful as being unreasonable. Yet since mirth easily gets out of hand, the virtue of eutrapelia, as we have been noting here, is found as a part of modesty or temperance, something that needs to be restrained under reason. And lastly, and it probably goes without saying, if one is going to be in danger of missing the mark, it's far better to miss the mark by way of deficiency of playfulness than excess. As St. Thomas says here, since in human life pleasure and rest are not in quest for their own sake, but for the sake of operation, it follows that lack of mirth is less sinful than excess thereof. Moving then to question 169 of modesty in the outward apparel, Article 1, whether there can be virtue and vice in connection with outward apparel, representing oneself as one is externally, as well as matching one's exterior appearance to the integrity of one's interior. These are virtues, while vainglory or hypocrisy, for example, these are vices. Even Scripture itself testifies to how the interior virtue or vice manifests itself in outward actions and dress of the human person, as it is written in Sirach chapter 19, a man's attire and open-mouthed laughter and a man's manner of walking show what he is. And so, as all of us likely already know, virtue and vice pertain to the manner in which a person dresses. And the rule of thumb when it comes to virtuous dress is that a man should dress according to his state and according to the custom of his time, and as a holy person in his situation would do or is doing. And above all, one should refrain from indulging in dress for the sake of vainglory, i.e., desiring to appear gloriously distinct, whether that be through overly ornate or overly impoverished attire, both of which can be a form of ostentation. In St. Thomas's words, those who are placed in a position of dignity, or again the ministers of the altar, are attired in more costly apparel than others, not for the sake of their own glory, but to indicate the excellence of their office or of the divine worship. This is not sinful. Hence Augustine says, whoever uses outward things in such a way as to exceed the bounds observed by the good people among whom he dwells, either signifies something by so doing or is guilty of sin, inasmuch as he uses these things for sensual pleasure or ostentation. Article 2, in our last article, whether the adornment of women is devoid of mortal sin. If a married woman dress in such a way that is becoming and in order to please her husband, there is nothing wrong with this. She is simply loving her neighbor, which is her husband. And again, in general, if men and women dress according to their station and according to the custom of their time and place, and as the holy people in their day dress, then this will be fine as well. But if an unmarried man or woman dress in such a way as to provoke a lust of those who happen to see them, then this will be mortally sinful, because it is contrary to charity to act in such a way as to destroy the soul of others. Now, of course, someone might say, why do I have to be concerned about those who look at me and observe modesty for their sake? And that is because we are responsible for one another. Our faiths are intertwined with one another as parts of a shared whole, whether that whole is society or the nation or the church. As St. Paul said in his letter to the Corinthians, although he was free to eat meat, for example, as a Christian, he said he would willingly never eat meat if by doing so it would scandalize any of the new converts to the faith. So to repeat one final time, there are no black and white rules given here for how men and women ought to dress, but as a general rule, one should dress as the holy persons in their identical state in life and place in time in which they live do, and in such a way as to build up their brothers and sisters in the practice of the faith. Which brings us to the close of another episode. We have just finished covering questions 168 and 169 of the Secunda Secundae, that is, of modesty as consisting in the outward movements of the body and of modesty in the outward apparel. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow